Good day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar on the topic, The Culture Factor in International Development and Its Implications for Global Business. Now, I would like to introduce Bianca Dahl. Bianca is a cultural and medical anthropologist who has been conducting research on the social effects of Botswana AIDS epidemic since 2003. Currently assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto, her work explores the aftermath of international humanitarian efforts to provide aid during the pandemic. Her first book project uses ethnographic methods to expose the unexpected consequences brought about by organizations attempting to provide culturally sensitive care for orphan children, moving outside the walls of aid institutions by following children into everyday spaces of village life. Her research reveals how and why donations of material goods and the emotional entanglements that accompany them are forging newly problematic patterns of social relations in rural Botswana. And with that, I would like to hand it off to Bianca.
Good day, everyone, and welcome. Thanks to Mirjana for the introduction and for monitoring the feeds and questions over the next hour. So today's session is going to provide a brief introduction to the importance of the concept of culture as it pertains to international development, to global philanthropy, and of course to the business world. As Mirjana mentioned, I'm by training a sociocultural and medical anthropologist. And some of the material that I'm going to be discussing today comes from my own research in Southern Africa, but also presents more generally some of the core ideas in the discipline of anthropology, which apply to everybody who works in multicultural or international settings and who cares even just a little bit about ensuring that the work that they do actually does more good than harm in the world today. Hopefully, that's all of you. All right. Sorry here. There we go. Moving on. So this session is going to proceed in 3 parts. First, I recognize that some of you, in fact, probably most of you, are not likely to be familiar with anthropology. It certainly seems that most of the people that I end up chatting with on airplanes or at dinner parties tend to think that anthropology is only about sorting pottery fragments that are dug out of ancient burial tombs. And it's not. So in what follows, we're going to start off with a simple working definition of the field, a basic discussion of anthropological methods, and what anthropologists mean when they talk about culture. Okay. In part 2, we'll move on from there to discuss why these understandings of culture are relevant for business people, for global development consultants, and just in general for any influential people who are committed to making the world a better place, whether that's through finance or business or philanthropy or what have you. Finally, in the third and final and undoubtedly longest part of the session today, I will be sharing with you some concrete examples of what I'm going to call the culture factor, as it is played out in the research that I've been conducting in Southern Africa over the past few years, in which global business, philanthropy, and international development projects are all implicated. So the point of this is hopefully to encourage all of us to reflect upon what cultural sensitivity means and why this actually matters for people who work in international settings in the midst of our increasingly globalized world. So I like to believe that most people care about cultural sensitivity, and probably all of you who decided to come to this session today think that it's important as business people to show sensitivity to cultural norms and values. But even efforts to be culturally sensitive can end up producing problematic and harmful initiatives. So throughout this session today, my main goal is pretty simple. It's to try and convince all of you of one key overall argument. That is that qualitative and ethnographic research tools, which are the tools of anthropology, together with a more nuanced understanding of what culture means, can be extremely useful, and I would go so far as to say morally necessary for global business leaders to grasp. If we don't take into consideration what I'll be calling the culture factor, then global business and even philanthropic and humanitarian initiatives risk not only not making people's lives better, but in fact making people's lives a whole lot worse. So that's the main point that I want us to be engaging with today. And let's start at the very beginning here in part 1 with an overview of what it is that we mean by culture. At its simplest level, anthropology is a discipline that's devoted to the study of culture, or how it is that human beings live our lives in our social context. So the first thing that's important to note here is that we're not talking about culture in the sense that you may have encountered when you were at primary school or elementary school, when you would have multicultural days in your classrooms. Or we're not also talking about the kind of food that your grandmother cooks, or international or national costumes, and maybe obsolete festival traditions, okay? So those are part of culture, but that's not actually how anthropologists tend to think about what culture means. What we mean when we talk about this concept is specifically the patterns and rationales by which people go about living everyday life, okay? We also mean the deeper principles that implicitly organize our social interactions with each other. So this includes things like values and customs and behaviors and beliefs and all kinds of ideas about politeness, notions about what the good things are in life. But I also want to really emphasize that culture is not just, it's not as simple as what people say matters to them, okay? So if you approach people with a clipboard conducting a survey and ask them about their feelings, for example, regarding 4 different possible preferences, okay, people might tell you something that doesn't actually reflect the kinds of practices that they engage in or that organize their everyday life. So culture in the anthropological sense, it's not a taste test. It's really about lived values, lived beliefs, and lived practices, okay? So instead, the main point of the anthropological methodology is for the research to try as much as possible to integrate him or herself into the group in question. So we describe this with something of an oxymoron, participant observation. This simply involves, in its most basic sense, talking to people in informal settings, as well as, conducting more formal tape-recorded interviews. And then looking for patterns that explain how we all actually go about making decisions and acting on our preferences and values. Okay, so it's looking at how people talk about their preferences in life, but also how it is that they actually enact those. Okay, and so one really important thing here is that culture isn't just something that exotic or different or other people have. Right? This approach is valuable for understanding our own cultures as well as those of other people. So you could conduct these kinds of methods or inquiry in your own companies, inside the boardroom of your own company. And in fact, increasingly today, anthropologists are studying things like Wall Street financial practices or the social organization of the World Bank, in addition to trying to answer questions like, for example, what are the social practices and the structural constraints, like poverty, that might help us understand why HIV rates are so high in Southern Africa. So among the main goals of anthropological research is a recognition that even as we try to make strange cultural practices appear familiar and reasonable, so we also need to try and recognize that our own seemingly reasonable practices are in fact pretty strange in the context of the larger globe, right? And it's worth noting the fairly obvious point, I think, that people themselves belong to multiple cultural groups, okay? We're not just determined by one culture. I think we could all agree that we behave differently at work compared to how we behave at home, compared to how we behave when we're visiting our mother-in-law, for example, okay? So nor is culture fixed or static. It's lived, it's dynamic, and it can rapidly shift as people's values respond to globalization and to social change. So culture is, in the most simple sense, it's an explanatory device that helps us to account for the breadth of human social variation. Okay. So I want us to now move on to part 2, which is why is this useful to global business, which is the line of work that most of you who are on the line are involved in. There's, at the most basic level, the obvious idea that the world is increasingly global, and we need to understand it as such. This year, I'm going to be teaching a course as part of the I.E. Brown Executive MBA curriculum. And we'll be exploring in greater depth the anthropological methodology, which is known as ethnography or ethnographic research, and which involves a range of methods, including participant observation, which is where you integrate yourself into a community or a culture or an organization for a long period of time in order to gather observations from a close-up or participant perspective about how people live their lives. In addition to this, anthropology has been increasingly appropriated in recent years into business school curricula. So some faculty members have referred to this as a naturalistic method that's very important for business. In a recent journal article that was published in the International Journal of Management Education, Robert Tian and Alf Wale wrote, "The naturalistic method that has risen to prominence in consumer research in recent years is clearly indebted to anthropological methods. The basic strategies of this approach are to engage in participant observation and to observe and interpret what people actually do in a real-life environment. Like anthropological fieldwork, this naturalistic method demands that researchers interpret behavior from the informant's perspective, not with reference to the feelings or opinions of the investigator. As a result of this informant-centered focus, researchers are able to more effectively perceive what motivates consumers and affects their responses." Anthropologists use ethnographic methods to address the whole complexity of human behaviors and to answer questions like, for example, why do people who have been well informed about how HIV is spread nonetheless persist in having unprotected sex? Or what cultural factors motivate people's choices just more generally? Why do global business ventures and philanthropic projects alike often produce unexpected outcomes when they're implemented in new cultural contexts? And how can we make sense of some of the most puzzling global trends, like the resistance on the part of many people to adopt self-protective strategies that maximize their life and their health, or the resistance that many people have to business and philanthropic investments that are designed to improve their lives. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So don't just take this from me. I'm sitting here in Canada, in Toronto, where Perrin Beatty gave a recent interview posted on the National Foreign Affairs Ministry website. So as he put it, from the perspective of a global business leader, there are a whole range of areas, both in terms of how to make sales and to promote our products and services abroad. For example, the development of relationships is absolutely key. I think the North American business ethic is you go in with good quality products at the lowest possible price, and that's going to be the winner. In much of Asia, the tradition has been that you develop and nurture relationships. Price is important, but it may not be the sole determining factor of whether a company will get a contract. Similarly, as we build partnerships with companies in other countries, it's very important for us to understand their business culture and to understand that we can't expect the rest of the world to simply do business on our terms. Now, because you are out there in far-flung corners of the globe and I can't see you, I want us to start us off with a quick question that will give us a sense of your interest in this topic. So, Mirjana, can we go to the first poll?
Absolutely. So now you can see the poll. The question is, in your professional life, what is the biggest arena in which culture is a factor in an important problem issue? Potential answers are when communicating with foreign partners and trying to adapt, in trying to design products, services, or interventions, in trying to create a distinctive company culture. I'm sorry, it seems like the entire potential answer is not visible, but I see that people are already voting.
Great.
Okay, let's give them a few more seconds, and I'm going to make sure that we have the second one in its entirety. Okay, so now we have the answers. 60% answered when communicating with foreign partners, 26% in trying to design products, and 19% in trying to create a distinctive company culture.
Okay, that's very interesting. I wasn't really sure what to predict in terms of the answers here, but we seem to have some variation. But let me just make a couple of comments here. The first two answers here deal with cultural difference, or what's sometimes called culture clash. The idea that people from different national and regional and socioeconomic backgrounds have different values and behavioral norms. And of course, the third answer deals with the notion of a group culture, right, trying to foster a community. In the rest of today's session, we're really going to be focusing on a couple of case studies that probably best fall underneath the first and the second answers, right? We're going to be looking at communicating with foreign partners and designing interventions, okay? So let's move on and give an example of the culture factor in play. Okay. And why it's important to actually understand the effects of cultural values as they influence the outcome of international ventures. So this is a brief account of an innovative attempt by a couple of different organizations to come up with creative social engineering solutions to a set of very pressing world problems that happen to intersect around the same social practice. And that social practice is the very common use of wood and coal-based cook stoves in many parts of the developing world. So in places where people don't have access to electricity or to gas-powered cooking implements, people often cook over open fires or wood and coal-fueled cook stoves, oftentimes inside or in enclosed spaces that are not properly ventilated. So this may not sound like, at first blush, that it's likely to be a serious global issue, but in fact, in the aggregate, it represents a series of significant problems. So for one, coal and wood-based fires and stoves are extremely bad for population health. The soot and the smoke that are produced by this method of cooking can have deleterious consequences on people's respiratory systems, infecting lungs with chemicals as well as contributing to the likelihood that people have infectious diseases as well. So further, the New York Times actually reported 4 years ago that many scientists claim that black carbon, which is also known as soot, may be responsible for 18% of global warming trends. That is second only to carbon dioxide emissions. So the bulk of the globe's black carbon emissions actually come from cooking stoves, from forest fires, and from the burning of wood more generally. And this happens to be most common in the developing world. So scientists, activists, and social entrepreneurs alike have pointed out that it is relatively inexpensive to produce solar-powered or clean-burning cook stoves for people who are unable to afford fancier stoves, right? And that this can have a real and important environmental outcome as well. This is sort of the low-hanging fruit approach to climate change. So the third global problem, along with health and environmental concerns, are the social considerations of this practice. So in many parts of the world, including in rural India, women and children are responsible for walking long distances to fetch firewood, to heat their homes, and, of course, to cook their food. So if you think about it for a minute, this has significant ramifications for issues surrounding gender inequality. So imagine if, instead of having to spend hours walking miles each day to fetch firewood, women were able to harness solar power to prepare their meals. This could open up significant amounts of time for women to engage in other forms of labor, perhaps even including microfinance projects like animal husbandry or household gardens. And in contexts where children are the ones who are most commonly going and fetching firewood, it can open up time for them to be engaged in attending school, right? So these are really important social concerns. For all three of these types of reasons, then, several organizations created an initiative a few years back where they handed out efficient cook stoves to a test community in India, in rural India. And this was part of a larger effort to market test several different types of alternative cookers among real-life villagers, right? However, a month into the project, researchers realized that many households had simply stopped using the innovative technologies entirely. Okay. Now I want to stop here for a moment and encourage you to reflect upon possible reasons why you think such a brilliant idea with so many important social, human, and environmental consequences may have been likely to fail in this context. So, Mariana, I'd like us to go now to poll number 2. Now, I know that you don't have the information in front of you to know for certain, but I'd like you to reflect upon what you think might be the most likely important factor and why people weren't using the cook stoves. So, Mariana, can you take poll 2?
Yes, the poll is on. It seems like we can't show the entire answer because it's too long, so I'm going to read out loud, and please feel free to vote in the meantime. Why do you think this project initially failed? A, because the organization had failed to consult with the men. Male villagers were suspicious of donors' motives for female empowerment and threw out the stoves. B, because the food cooked on the low-emission cook stoves didn't taste as good as the food cooked over an open fire. C, because most women began cooking for the family well before the sun was up and the organization did not explain that you don't need full sunlight to power solar stoves. And D, because the women's main source of social interaction with other women was when they left their households to collect firewood each morning. And let's give them a few more seconds to answer.
Just go for a guess, right? There's no consequences.
Okay, so I think we now have results. 8% answered A, 4% B, 11% C, and 77% answered because the women's main source of social interaction with other women was when they left their households.
Okay. That is phenomenal, actually. I'm interested that there was so much agreement on the idea that it was women's social interaction. And in fact, what that reflects is that you are, in fact, thinking anthropologically. However, you're wrong. The actual answer that the researchers discovered was, in fact, B, which is the one that only 4% of you guys chose. The answer was a quite simple factor, right? It was that the food didn't taste as good. As it turns out, all those harmful emissions from smoking wood fires are part of what give rotis and chapatis their delicious flavor. So certainly all of the other explanations that I put up here are plausible. And in fact, they may well have played a role in the distaste that many women expressed towards the cook stoves. Without a detailed anthropological inquiry, we don't really know for sure. But we know that the survey research they conducted, the self-reported reason was by far and away that the food didn't taste as good. Researchers also commented that the cook stoves looked scientific and were rather flimsily built. But the main reason that women seemed reluctant to use this new technology was that they missed the way that their food tasted. And if we think about this a little bit more, perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that if you live in conditions of poverty and do not have access to many material resources, you may be willing to sacrifice hours of your day in pursuit of firewood, just as your family has always done, if it means that the food you fill your belly with actually seems worth eating. And this isn't an irrational thing, right? The important point here is that priorities that might make sense to wealthier people, design mavens, and entrepreneurs from the global north are not necessarily the same priorities that matter to people in other parts of the world. Okay. So probably most of us have encountered a narrative about the role of culture. Hang on, let me go back to the slides here. Okay, about the role of culture in complicating development and humanitarian and business initiatives, which fits a fairly standard story. So it's tempting to suggest that the people just simply weren't educated enough to look out for their own best interests. And certainly in the context of international business, when we find people from other cultural backgrounds behaving in ways that seem to be against their best interests, as in this case, it's easy and perhaps even common to think that the primary problem may lie with them, that it's because they lacked certain forms of education or because they're holding on to traditional values at the expense of innovations that will make their lives ultimately healthier, happier, and more harmonious. But very often, and I might even say most often, this kind of explanation of the culture factor is wrong. Culture is not in and of itself an obstacle to the development and business successes. Okay, so in fact, many of the times when projects fail, it's not because of a lack of education on the part of the intended beneficiaries of the innovation. It's because of a lack of education on the part of the well-intentioned social entrepreneurs who are failing to understand the values that ultimately matter most for people's lives as a whole. And certainly in the parts of the world where I work, people very much aspire towards becoming, so-called modern individuals. There's a great desire to join in the global economy. But the ways that people want to become modern are not the same around the world. And again, ultimately, to drive the point home here, culture in and of itself is, again, not an obstacle to innovation. Instead, the task of responsible global citizens like us, hopefully, who are participating in the global economy is to try to recognize the push-pull factors that influence people's choices and priorities. Okay. So let's move on to the third part of, third and final part of our session today. So now I want to discuss some examples that are closer to my own heart and come from my own research. For the last decade, I have been conducting ethnographic research in various different locations within the country of Botswana, which, for those of you who don't know, is a landlocked country in southern Africa that's famous for being a stable democracy and a model economy in the African context. Okay? So it also is simultaneously infamous for having the dubious distinction of the world's second highest per capita HIV prevalence. Okay? Current estimates, in fact, are that 24.8% of Botswana's adult population has HIV or AIDS. Okay, that's a quarter of adults are HIV positive. A third of pregnant women are infected with the virus. And in the single most affected age cohort, adults who are between the ages of 35 and 45 years, which I suspect includes quite a lot of the people who are on the line today, 40.5% of these adults have contracted HIV or AIDS. Okay. Almost 1 out of every 5 children has been orphaned. And it's worth noting that the definition of orphaning is that a child has lost both parents if they're raised in a 2-parent household, or their primary caregiver if they're raised in a single-parent household, which for complicated reasons is in fact a very common form in Botswana today. Okay. So in the year 2000, Botswana's then president, Festus Mogae, appealed to the United Nations General Assembly for international aid intervention, for partnerships with AIDS research institutions from the global north, and for a multisectoral initiative that would be supported by foreign donors and investors to combat the social effects of this terrible epidemic. Okay, he called on the international community to come and help this otherwise very successful African country in dealing with its tremendous health problem. As he put it, the challenge of the millennium is to reverse the effects of the pandemic, not only through prevention and care strategies, but through meaningfully addressing the structural determinants, such as poverty and gender inequality, which exacerbate the spread of HIV and AIDS. What is really required of us is a social revolution, a willingness to commit, to share, and to prioritize, a social vaccine against harmful practices and the violation of human rights. We have inner strength in our humanity to win this war. Okay. And I think it's simultaneously an inspirational message that he was giving, and also a fairly anthropological one. He's concerned about the structural determinants like poverty and gender inequality. But he also called upon the international community to become involved, to really spawn what ended up being a tremendous and remarkable international effort on the part of global business leaders, generous philanthropists, North American and European researchers, and even the pharmaceutical giant Merck Pharmaceuticals, who all found themselves unlikely bedfellows in pursuit of the same worthy goals. Okay, the multisectoral intervention in Botswana aimed to combat the spread of the virus, to help provide care for the people who are already infected, to hand out free antiretroviral drugs to all people in the country who needed them, and of course, to ensure that children who'd been orphaned by the epidemic would not face significantly poorer life chances as a result of their parents' death. Okay. Now, orphan care may seem to be a less pressing concern than issues around prevention and treatment. But actually, in the social context of southeastern Botswana, where I began doing fieldwork in 2003, and where I've done altogether a total of over 40 months of field research in the last 10 years, the care of orphans has been of paramount concern. And this has to do with the fact that HIV is actually extremely unusual in the world's history of pandemic situations. So most epidemics disproportionately target the very young and the very old, who tend to have the weakest immune systems and are thereby more likely to succumb to viruses like, for example, cholera or the plague or tuberculosis, right? So HIV and AIDS together are unusual in that they target, at least in the developing world, adults who are in their reproductive prime. Okay, so across the world, with a few exceptions, located mostly in the so-called global north, the primary mode in which HIV is spread is through heterosexual sex. Okay, and so adults in their reproductive prime are the ones that are most likely to contract the virus. These are people who have been having unprotected sex, and of course, almost by definition, are therefore likelier to have already had children who then become orphaned in the wake of their parents' death. So certainly as people in Botswana understand the epidemic, they see it as a disease of orphaning. The epidemiological facts and the demographic profile do in fact back this up. So Botswana has the highest rate of orphaning of any country in the world. And all of this is of extremely recent import. In fact, as some scholars have argued, there really didn't even exist as a social category the notion of orphan, right? Anything that perfectly fit what we think of as orphans today did not really even exist in Botswana prior to the HIV epidemic. So in fact, in the early response to the epidemic, when international development agencies like UNICEF tried to raise awareness and to describe orphans in what they thought was a culturally sensitive fashion, they used the Setswana word that they thought was closest to it. And the word is Decode Zana, which in fact actually doesn't quite mean orphan, as a child who's just lost one or both of their parents, but in fact meant children who had been cut off from their kinship networks entirely. So these were kids who had not only lost their parents, but who had no relatives left at all who were able or willing to take care of them. And this is actually a deeply stigmatized, deeply pitiable state that the historical record suggests, in fact, existed more in the social imagination than in what we might think of as reality, right? So my research looks at the social and cultural and individual effects of international development efforts to provide what they thought of as being culturally sensitive forms of orphan care for children in Botswana. Now, this may not initially seem like a set of concerns that most global business leaders should have to be involved in, but in fact, they have been involved in this. And what I want to talk about today is one particular orphan care project that was funded by international donors, by aid agencies, by the news media, including the Today Show in the United States on NBC, and even by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we'll get back to Bill Gates towards the end of the session today. So the model that was created by one orphan care organization was really touted as being a cutting-edge and innovative social entrepreneurial solution to the challenges that Botswana faced in providing support for family members who had become burdened with the care of orphans all across the nation, right? So again, 1 out of every 5 children was basically being thrust upon their aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Now, the forms of international engagement in this project reflected in some ways the best side of globalization, its softer side, right, its humanitarian potential. And in what follows, I'm going to describe how this project's efforts at cultural sensitivity initially made it popular in the local context, and certainly made it popular with donors and investors. But I'm going to suggest here that the same efforts toward cultural sensitivity actually ironically ended up producing a set of organizational practices that ultimately led to the demise of the center and to serious negative outcomes for the children who had been targeted by it. Now, I'm convinced that the lessons of this organization are helpful, are useful, and maybe even are necessary for business people who work in international arenas to reflect upon. So this is both a case study in the anthropological tradition to help showcase the value of ethnographic research. And I also like to think of it as an important object lesson in why culture matters for leaders who are working with the developing world today. Now, the program, the project started, that I'm going to talk about here, started as a feeding center for orphans who were in need of extra care, either because they lived with relatives who were destitute or because their caregivers, their aunts, uncles, and grandparents were not able or perhaps not willing to provide sufficiently high quality of care for those children. So it was created in one southeastern Botswana village by a European man who had moved to Botswana and married a local woman. And in fact, the idea was brilliant. Okay? This program, I'm going to, for the sake of ensuring the privacy of my research subjects, I'm going to call it by a pseudonym that I use in my own research, Batusi Orphan Daycare Center. Okay? Batusi was designed to help support family members to achieve the very culturally desired goals of taking care of their family's orphans without having to resort to sending children to residential orphanage institutions, which are, in fact, deeply stigmatized and are seen as markers of the failures of the kinship system in Botswana. So quite surprisingly, in the country that has the highest rate of orphaning in the world, there are very few residential orphanages. And in fact, a survey that was done in the late 90s suggested that 97% of orphans in Botswana were cared for within their family networks. Okay. So people in Botswana were extremely anxious about what to do with this newly identified population of children whose parents had died. Concerns about whether family members were abusing or neglecting orphans led to a widespread agreement in the village where Batusi was launched that it would be a good thing to have a supplemental care center, which provided after-school support, tutoring, recreational activities, and sometimes healthy and sometimes deliciously junk foody hot meals for the children who returned each night to the homes of their family members, thereby remaining connected to their kin and culture, as the European director of the center proclaimed. So a culturally sensitive solution to the orphan problem required foreign donor support, which actually came in the form of grants from the local arm of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in partnership with Merck Pharmaceuticals, along with a long list of phenomenal other donors, development organizations, even local businesses in Botswana, which donated clothing, food, and other necessary resources to contribute to the running of this center. Batusi also boasted several income-generating projects, such as a furniture workshop that was staffed by young men from the village who had no other opportunities for wage labor. So I think we can probably all agree that this sounds like a really good idea, right? And as such, the residents of the village where Batusi was located were remarkably positive about the intervention after they overcame their initial concerns. And at this time, I think it's important to remember here that orphans were the symbol both of the worst effects of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, but they were also symbols of hope for the future of humanity, right? They inspired elements of international collaboration and partnership in the name of protecting the reproduction and survival of Botswana society. That is, until the center began to grow in its international profile and succeed even more in reaping the benefits of donor goodwill. So in mid-2004, I did my first fieldwork in 2003, and in mid-2004, I arrived back at Batusi for a period of 6 months of anthropological research, which was my second foray. In the wake of international media attention, in the intervening time since I had last been there, foreign volunteers from all over the world began to flock toward the center in their desire to be a part of this really innovative solution that was taking care of needy children. So I joined 9 volunteers at that time, most of whom came from Europe and North America, who were crammed into just a couple of bedrooms on the care center's site. And this marked an era of intense competition for children's affection. Now, each of these volunteers was motivated by a genuine desire to be useful, but they were also unfamiliar with some elements of local cultural norms, and many of them began to engage in practices that were somewhat problematic. They encouraged the children to sit on their laps and used familial language to speak to them, calling them my son, my daughter, my niece, my nephew, my little brother, my little sister. At the same time, the children quickly learned that volunteers had a difficult time refusing their requests for things, ranging from clothes to wristwatches that had alarms in them to toys. And in the culture that emerged at this center, many children very quickly became quite adept at developing what seemed like emotionally intense relationships with volunteers who felt it really difficult to refuse the children's requests for things. And I want to briefly highlight 2 issues in particular that emerged out of this organizational structure and design that ended up creating problematic outcomes for the local culture. And the first key issue is around material goods, donations. Now, to help you understand why this is an issue, I need to say just a few brief words about Botswana's cultural norms around kinship and families. In the local context, when people talk about providing care within families, a lot of the focus is on reciprocity, wherein adults can and in fact are expected to provide material resources to the children in their family network. So this includes things like food for the children to eat, clothing, school uniforms, school fees, toiletries, and other necessities. Adults provide things, and in response, children are expected to contribute to household labor, okay? Doing things like fetching firewood, hauling water, washing their own clothing once they get old enough to do so, and of course, obeying their elders. So as such, many rural Botswana villagers explicitly understand kinship as being meaningful not just for calculating how people are biologically related, but also for creating forms of social organization that reflect forms of local morality, right? Like what makes good people. And for them, the work of creating happy homes and households is fundamental to building up social relationships more generally. But when Batusi began to succeed in drawing ever more donor support, it began to take over the role of providing for children's material needs and necessities with worrying results. Donors decided to provide important forms of support for the kids, like one organization that bought athletic shoes for the children, most of whom had only one pair of shoes, which were tattered black plastic footwear that often had the toes or the heels cut out to allow room for growth. This seems like a pretty good thing to do. And in fact, in an effort to really emphasize the organization's transparency, the European director encouraged supporters of the organization to send material resources directly rather than just sending money. So as he reasoned, if supporters are sending clothing and toys rather than just money, they know that those gifts are going directly to the children's needs. They're not being corrupted or diverted into corrupt practices. But soon, volunteers and overseas donors alike were inundating village orphans with the kinds of desirable material items that kids raised in North America or Europe, or for example, for that matter, middle-class families the world over are used to having. But these orphans were not especially used to fancy meals at restaurants in the capital city, or having a lot of dolls and toy cars, even battery-operated helicopters that actually fly, or cell phones that were loaded up with phone credits. Family members became uncomfortable with the fact that orphans were receiving so many gifts from foreign donors. Many aunts and uncles who were guardians of Batusi's orphans began to confiscate some of the gifts given to the kids and redistribute them among non-orphan children in the broader family. And unfortunately, this fit stereotypes on the part of foreign donors that family members neglected orphans. So in the name of protecting children's rights, Batusi was crafting practices that were deeply problematic. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, given a local cultural logic that is associated with material resource provision, right, which I just spoke about, the connection between giving things and the building of family bonds, orphans started to compare the kinds of gift giving that they received at the center with the far more meager forms of material support that their family members were able to give them. And orphans decided that they would rather be family members with the care center. So this led to comments, and I've just given you a couple examples here. One 17-year-old boy said to me out of the blue, "At Batusi, they love us more than my uncles do." And another girl, 14, said, "People at Batusi are my real family now." I began to hear these statements all the time. And as an example of the consequences this had in terms of family and in terms of how it is that villagers thought about orphans, I want to offer a very brief ethnographic case study, or what we call an anecdote. Okay, this is a true case study a true story that happened in 2005. So a local social worker ended up telling me this story. She went on a Saturday morning to visit a family of 2 orphans who lived with her aging grandmother. So the older orphan was a girl called Agatha. She was age 12 at the time. And Agatha, this particular Saturday morning, was sitting around her family home wearing dirty and disheveled clothing when the social worker came to call. The woman began to scold Agatha for taking no pride in her personal appearance and her cleanliness, which are considered extremely important. After being scolded for not washing her clothing, Agatha responded by insisting that she, quote, never washed clothes. Now, the social worker assumed that the child was exaggerating or perhaps admitting to laziness, and she resumed her lecture. By way of explanation, Agatha took her visitor by the hand and led her to a dilapidated storage shed at the back of the family property. She opened wide the door, and to the social worker's shock and horror, she realized that the hut was overflowing from floor to ceiling with unwashed children's clothing. As it turned out, Agatha and her brother had discovered that the aid workers at the Orphan Care Center didn't keep very close track of the donations they received all the time. So she and her brother would get an outfit, which they would wear for days on end, until one of the volunteers noticed that their clothing was soiled and picked out a new outfit for the 2 children. When Agatha said she did not clean her clothes, she was telling the literal truth. The social worker was horrified as she related this story to me after the fact, insisting that these children had become so materialistic that no adult seemed to be able to get through to them, to instruct them in appropriate moral values. So, as the woman put it, baratadilo, which in Setswana means they like things. This is a very increasingly common epithet that became very common during the middle years of this care center's operation, which accused orphans of being materialistic, but also was very specifically suggesting that they like things instead of relationships with people. Now, one last example here, second key issue. The second key issue of cultural misunderstanding occurred through a practice that was started by the European man who directed the center, and I'm going to call him Pete. And it has to do with emotions. As the international profile of this orphan care center grew, Pete became increasingly concerned with donor outreach. It became a primary concern of the center. In anticipation of a visit from Bill Gates to Botswana, Pete decided to create what he thought of as an innovative music therapy program for the children. Now, he had noticed that there's a very strong cultural value placed on singing and dancing in Botswana. And this happens to be extremely prevalent during funeral practices in this rural village and in other parts of Botswana as well. And he thought that he could appropriate the cultural prevalence of singing and dancing to help children learn to deal with their grief in the face of their losses. Okay, this would be a safe space where they could talk about losing their parents. Now, this may seem like a good idea, but it was unfortunately premised on a bit of a misunderstanding of local cultural norms and values. People in Botswana, like in many parts of the world, don't generally think of emotions like grief and sadness as things that reside deep within an individual person. So in North America, we sometimes say that if we feel jealousy, or if I feel jealous of someone, that it eats me up inside. Well, in Botswana, if somebody says that they feel jealous of someone, the concern might be that that would actually negatively affect the person who is the target of the jealousy. Okay, this may seem a little bit strange to some of you, but what they do is essentially recognize that strong negative feelings can have a social force of their own. And certainly in the wake of all of the premature deaths that have been associated with the HIV epidemic, villagers with whom I spoke discussed the importance of really regulating their negative feelings, lest they become overcome with depression, anxiety, or anger, and perhaps inadvertently engage in practices like witchcraft, or just overflow the village with the social force of negative sentiments. So what this means, in effect, is that at funerals, people tend to sing and dance as a means of trying to physically produce more appropriate sentiments in their own bodies and in their own hearts. Singing and dancing is not a means of dwelling in grief, but rather a means of pushing past it, of producing an appropriate sense of joy at the blessings of the deceased person's life, rather than fixating on sadness and personal loss. So in this context, Tswana children tend not to exhibit sadness or talk openly about their parents' death. And to foreign aid workers, this seemed rather uncomfortable or strange. One man whom I call Ted was in fact a psychologist in the United States, told me in a moment of candor that he thought the biggest problem here in Botswana is that they don't let their children grieve. And Pete, in some ways, had a similar sense, right? And he decided to write some songs that the children might sing for Bill Gates during his visit that would describe the social challenges they faced, and which would also provide the children with an appropriate setting in which to sing through their grief and put words to their sense of loss. So when he first taught the children the lyrics of a song in English that he had written called Sometimes, it was all about their parents looking down on them from in heaven. Now, of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, the children initially sang this song in a manner befitting Botswana funeral dancing. That is, they sang this sad song about their parents watching down on them in heaven with big smiling faces, exaggerated body movements, and beaming expressions. And I have to admit that this looked incongruous even to my own eyes. During one practice session, I watched as Pete stopped the practice and insisted to the children that this is a sad song, that they should be singing with sad faces. At that moment, he beckoned a small child from the front row to come towards him. And taking her face in his hands, he literally molded the appropriate expression onto her face, initially to the hilarity of the other children. But they soon realized that he was perfectly serious, and they all began to practice singing with sad faces. Now, in and of itself, this may not have been a hugely influential practice, but the children quickly realized that those of them who could sing in the most emotionally appropriate fashion were most likely to be rewarded and selected to go sing for the many development organization meetings that wanted children's choral entertainment. Okay? So as children were increasingly rewarded for performing sad faces, they soon lost the ability to code switch. That just means that they began to perform the wrong types of emotional expressions in the wrong cultural context. So I don't have time to get into great detail on this, but I do want to give a very brief example involving a girl called Grace. Grace had learned to talk about her dead mother in somber tones with foreign volunteers, oftentimes eliciting really empathic responses from them, even though sometimes some of the aid workers commented privately to me and to each other that Grace could seem a little manipulative. On one occasion when I stopped to visit Grace's aunt, who was a friend of mine, she told me the story of a recent family funeral, during which Grace suddenly, very inappropriately, burst into tears and ran out of the ceremony sobbing. Rather than eliciting a comforting response or sympathy, because this behavior is so inappropriate in the local context, and frankly unusual, it's out of character for how children and adults alike normally mourn in Botswana, this aunt ridiculed Grace for just simply showing off. Whether or not her experience, her crying was an authentic reflection of what Grace felt at that moment, or whether it was an inappropriate performance of the wrong type of emotion, the point is that the foreign intervention had laid the path for Grace's behavior to be viewed by her relatives and villagers as problematic in the local context. And in 2006, I encountered an increasing number of people complaining about the Orphan Care Center, including this woman here, Kefile's grandmother. Kefile was an orphan at the organization, And her grandmother once stopped me and said, you know, these kids are going up and down to the bars. They don't listen to their adults anymore. We can't control them. It's like they won't even listen to their elders. It's a problem. These children aren't listening to their relatives. We need to close the center down. And in fact, the center was shut down in 2006. And it only took about a month before relatives like Kefilia's grandmother started to complain, this center needs to be reopened because nobody can make these orphans listen to us anymore. Now, some of the orphans have done well, but others of them continue to be alienated from their relatives, struggling to feed themselves, to find wage labor. And I think in a larger sense, there's a general negative reaction against what are often seen as entitled orphans across Botswana. So by not taking into consideration local ideas about material resource provision and the authority that giving things entails, the care center had already usurped the role of good kin from the relatives who took care of the orphans at nighttime only. And then by not taking into consideration local ideas about emotion and grief, the care center contributed to transforming orphans from being pitied members of society who had suffered the worst form of hardship imaginable into rather morally repugnant and socially inappropriate youth who did not know how to behave. Okay. So in thinking about the aftermath of this organization, I just want to conclude with a couple comments here. This, I promised you I would get back to Bill Gates at the end. And this is a quote that I've taken off a letter that Bill and Melinda Gates wrote for their foundation. And I don't mean to be picking on Bill Gates here, who does phenomenal work, but let's just look at what he says about it. So some of the projects that we fund will fail. We not only accept that, we expect it, because we think that the essential role of philanthropy is to make bets on promising solutions that governments and businesses can't afford to make. As we learn which bets pay off, we have to adjust our strategies and share the results so everyone can benefit. Okay. And I'd like us just to think as you go throughout the day, and as we'll go a little bit over time here and engage in some questions in a moment. What lessons could we give to Bill Gates? I think first of all, it's worthy taking risks, but donors and business people don't always know best, right? Donor purse strings are connected to donor heartstrings, but this can lead to troubling practices in an intercultural context. And of course, failed aid projects can cause lasting and serious damage. Humanitarianism and development and global business initiatives are serious undertakings. These things have moral responsibilities associated with them. Okay? And then just more generally, the lessons that I hope that we can take away from this session today are that cultural sensitivity has to be more than just surface deep or skin deep, right? It's actually incredibly difficult and time-consuming to come to understand people's complicated priorities and values. In fact, the issue with this program was not about a lack of good intentions, but rather a failure to understand lived experiences, right? What we've been calling the culture factor. And working in a global world requires more than just a passing understanding of culture. It requires getting in there and getting hands dirty, right? So just to conclude here, Botswana continues to struggle with orphan care issues. The other part of the intervention has been tremendously successful, I should say, which is that HIV and AIDS rates have dropped. People's life expectancies have dramatically increased in the wake of this multisectoral international response. So the story I'm trying to tell here isn't just a sad one, but I'd like to end by reiterating the importance of a deeper understanding of culture. So I'm not just saying that because I want all of you business people out there to go and hire anthropologists in your companies, although I think that my students would probably thank you for that. I'm saying this mainly because the world is globalizing, but human diversity isn't going away. The challenge for all of us is to be nuanced and responsible in our work and to continue to engage the culture factor as an ongoing work in progress. Okay, now I know we're sort of up against our time, but we're going to stay on the line for about 10 more minutes here. And I'd like to invite any of you who have questions, comments, and reactions to please send them over to Mariana, who will select a few of them and read them out loud.
Okay, perfect. We already have a few questions for you, so we can start. How do we empower the indigenous within the context of their own culture when we help them to be better participants in their own self-care? How do we break the cycle of enabling and empower the cultures we're trying to help?
Well, I think that that's exactly the right question. And the first way of starting is just to ask that question, right? So ask yourself and ask people, how do we break this cycle? Certainly in the case of the orphan care issue that I've been talking about here today, I think one of the easiest solutions is to recognize that when you give material resources just to children, you're actually circumventing the importance, the authority of family members. And I actually think that a more culturally sensitive solution to this sort of program would have been, in fact, to include all children who lived in the same households with orphans, and to target material resource provision more towards the families rather than just towards children. That's a more particular answer. The larger question is, I think that it's important to go and to talk to people not just holding a clipboard and a tape recorder in front of them, not just to conduct very formal interviews with people, but to go down and spend some time in local context where you're hoping to be able to work with people, whether it's your business partners or whether you're trying to create a new sort of product or intervention in another part of the world with which you are unfamiliar. So the first step is just educating yourself, talking to people.
Okay, here's the next one. How can we perhaps develop an iterative approach to developing culturally sensitive solutions? Certain things might be learned only as the project develops, gets going, and culture is dynamic and changing.
Well, I mean, actually, in some ways, this is a very similar kind of question. And developing an iterative approach is exactly the challenge and the important thing. And so I think that the bottom line is to recognize that much of the kinds of monitoring and evaluation programs that exist for international development efforts, and also, in fact, that exist as research in terms of determining whether, for example, a product that's being rolled out in a new market is actually taking hold and being used and is serving the need that it was intended to serve. Much of that, the monitoring and evaluation process, tends to just focus on quick trips that researchers do when they fly into a center, they talk to a few people, often heads of organizations or local business people, and then they fly out again. I've seen this happen in Botswana in a number of different orphan care institutions where people who come from, for example, a big organization in the United Kingdom will fly to Botswana for only 24 to 48 hours and we'll go and interview people at an orphan care institution. And I've found and been very surprised to find that women in these institutions who worked there, who were often very critical of the kinds of practices that the institution was creating in their local environment, some of these women would actually say very positive things about the orphan care institution to the monitoring and evaluation companies. And the main reason they did that is because they felt pressure to say what they thought the monitoring and evaluation team wanted to hear. And so there's a simple solution, which is to do an iterative approach. If you can't just go in once off. You have to develop relationships with people. And sometimes that means hiring local people who are going to act as middlemen, right, or who are going to spend more time in a local context and actually gain more information over a period of time. And this is one of the main tenets of participant observation, which is it does actually take some time.
Okay, thank you. Here's the next one. How do we counteract the effects of cultural imperialism in aid with unintended consequences, such as the story you just described?
That's such a great question. Well, I mean, I would love to hear what you all have to say. Unfortunately, we don't have a poll that we can easily slide up on the screen here, right? I think that, I think the important thing is to recognize the point that I made a few slides ago, which is about how donor purse strings tend to be connected to donor heartstrings. I actually happen to believe that donors care about doing good work, right? I think that probably everybody who's just listened to this story about this orphan care institution probably shares my sentiment that this could have been done in a more culturally sensitive way, right? And in fact, in Botswana, there's a concern that on the part of people that run orphan care institutions, that the donors only want to serve programs that really have the sort of the notion that orphans have been cut off by their families, that they've been abused, and that orphans somehow are a special population. And I attended a child care forum, I think it was in 2006, where I saw many Botswana social workers speaking to a panel of donors from UNICEF and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other organizations. And the local social workers said, hey, you know, you guys are standing up here and you're telling us that you want to support innovative and culturally sensitive projects, but actually the projects that tend to get funded are just ones that pull orphans out of their social context and give orphans resources instead of the kids that they live with as well, right? And it's true for me that one of the most compelling memories that I have of the field research I did in Botswana was of all the children who lined up around the wire mesh fence on a daily basis, just hanging onto the fence around the Tutsi Orphan Daycare Center, looking in and watching all the kind of funny things that went on as foreign volunteers taught the kids to play games like freeze tag and Red Rover. And those kids tended to be the cousins who lived in the same homes as the orphan kids, but they weren't allowed into the program. And when this came up in the child care forum, I was really struck by the intelligence behind what the social workers said. They themselves wanted to combat the forms of cultural imperialism. And I have to say that the response of UNICEF and the donor panel was incredibly, incredibly shocked. I mean, they all said, we want to be funding programs that aren't just providing for orphans, but are actually providing for all needy children. But we're not seeing any of those projects cross our desk. So the complicated answer to your much more straightforward question here is to recognize that cultural imperialism is something that can come out of donor practices. It can come out of the choices that are made on the part of donor organizations in terms of which projects get funded. But in fact, it's much more complicated than that. Sometimes in a local context, people anticipate forms of cultural imperialism, and they provide programs that they think are more likely to get funded as opposed to ones that may in fact better reflect the needs of the community as a whole. And so I think one of the important things that can be done is for business leaders and philanthropists and development agents to really make a concerted effort to talk to people about what the greatest possible outcomes can be and what the widest range and the largest you know, and most appropriate forms of aid might be and what those might look like. So I think by taking a proactive approach, maybe by talking to local anthropologists, but maybe just by talking to the people that actually work at these organizations and giving them a sense of empowerment and a voice, I think donor agencies can actually really do a much more sensitive approach to these issues.
Okay, do we have,
one more question.
Okay, one more. And this is a really interesting one. But Tutsi had some victories and failures. What 3 things would you have done differently to ensure this good effort didn't go sour?
Ooh, I like that question. Well, I've sort of preempted it a little bit by saying that I think that aid that targets children as a whole, needy children as a whole, instead of just orphans, would have gone a long way towards ensuring that that children in this local environment, that orphans were not sort of cut off as a specific population that became very problematic. So I would have definitely liked to see this orphan care organization actually providing forms of support for families as a whole, for needy children as a whole, not just those who had lost their family members. And that, in fact, is a more culturally sensitive form of support. I think that in Botswana, you know, the fact that there really wasn't a category that mapped onto the notion of orphan before the AIDS epidemic came about, I think that's really telling. It's an important consideration. So the first issue is that I'd like to see more inclusive forms of support. Okay. The second thing is to recognize that there's such thing as too much of a good thing. And in fact, I've given talks about my research at various scholarly organizations, including the African Studies Association meetings. And I remember one time telling the story about material resources in Botswana, and a man stood up in the audience who was from Malawi, and he said, "I just have one question for you. In my country, we would really like to have the kinds of problems that Botswana has." And what he meant was that there's so little forms of donor support in rural Malawi. There's so much destitution and so much need that, in fact, he felt that the embarrassment of riches that was going on in Botswana, the excess of forms of donor support, was both inequitable and, in a larger sense, it was a pretty good sort of problem to have. And I think that definitely is true. So I think checks and balances that look at how it is that material resources get given through donor aid are really important. And this is going to tap into my third and final point. You let me have three, so that's how many I'm going to take. My third and final point fits in with a larger corpus of research that looks at sort of the negative effects of aid. And this is, if you want to read more about this, you can look at Dambisa Moyo's books. They've been very popular. She's an economist from Zambia who wrote a book a few years ago called Dead Aid. And in it, she argued that she didn't want any forms of humanitarian and development aid anymore to Africa because she felt that it disincentivized people from finding their own local solutions to issues, which in her estimation should be financial solutions, that we should be fostering business, fostering microfinance, instead of just fostering donor goods, just throwing money at problems and pouring our leftover T-shirts from the global north into parts of the world where they might arguably benefit by giving jobs to the family members who are taking care of lots of orphans rather than just giving them free T-shirts, right? So I certainly think that there are, there's another conversation we could have about some of the challenges and difficulties associated with things like microfinance, but I think it is important to recognize that there are other forms of aid that can, in fact, perhaps produce overall solutions that help actually support people in solving their own problems, and that you would find that certainly in the parts of the world where I work, that's actually what people themselves want. So I think we've gone over our session time already here. I'd love to carry on having a conversation, and as you may have noticed by the slide that we stopped on here, I do have my email details. I would love to hear from you if you have other questions and so forth. Depending on how many emails I receive, it may take me a little while to respond to you, but I absolutely would love to hear your further questions and comments and suggestions. But really the take-home point I want all of you to walk away with today is that this can be done in a more effective way, and that there are tools that exist for all of us that we can all engage in that can be very simple practices to allow us to be much more culturally sensitive and to be much more aware and effective global citizens. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope to hear from you in the future.
Thank you so much, Bianca, for the wonderful presentation. As you mentioned, everyone can contact you directly and send a question because we have so many and just didn't have enough time to address all of them. And thank you all for attending today. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.